Okay, here we go. We are now screen sharing, and this is a quick video recording, hopefully, of the idea of Baha'i ontology. This is for our Wilmette Institute class, and shout out to Dr. Misha and Dr. Rob and our whole group of all our good friends that are with me in this awesome class. So we're on the unit 3 now. We're on, or unit 4, we're on to the idea of what is Baha'i ontology. Ontology is the $50 word for the concept, meaning what is reality? What is real? And I don't know if my arrow is big enough for you to see here, but when you look at Baha'i philosophy in general, or even any kind of a philosophy in general, it's broken down usually into ontology, epistemology, taxonomy, and teleology, meaning, translating that, ontology would be reality. What do we think is real? Is God real? What do we think of God's reality? Are human beings real? What is our reality? Why are we here? Questions like that. However, right now we're going to go over a real quick diagram here. I'm not going to spend hours on this, not death by PowerPoint, but on a different, narrower topic called the practice of Baha'i ontology, meaning how is it practical in our lives, what Baha'u'llah has brought now as a completely new spiritual system, and how does it relate to some of the past, especially the Dharmic paths of Buddhism. And so we want to get real narrowly focused on that aspect of ontology of what does this mean to me in my life. It's not beginning with words and ending with words kind of thing. I do have a book. I've got a quote. Let me grab it here. When we get to the framing section, this is really important that we do a quick quote on this, on the framing aspect of ontology, which is kind of a unique personal side from the systems thinking. Anyway, we'll jump right into this. We'll begin with the central idea of iOS, which it's not an app for your iPhone. Well, it could be, but it's basically the idea of the illusion of separateness. And this is from the Dharmic idea of Buddhism, and certainly very much repeated by and completely enhanced and changed dramatically and wondrously by Baha'u'llah and the Baha'i system, because it tied to the idea of unity. And I will propose the other idea of inseparability from a quantum field theory viewpoint. So the illusion of separateness is in Buddhism and certainly in the Baha'i faith, another dharmic framing of our lives and our reality and our ontology, is that separation is an illusion. We are one being, and we'll get into the three worlds in terms of God, the manifestations of prophets, and humanity, and how those are actually one reality, and it's basically our framing that separates things out from the standpoint of our survival ego, wanting to think our way to happiness and joy. In terms of happiness and joy, we'll jump right in. I'm not going to get a lot into epistemology and taxonomy, etc. Basically, epistemology is how do we know things? What is the source of knowledge and authority? In the Baha'i faith, it's Baha'u'llah, our manifestation for today, the reappearance of the Buddha, Jesus, Muhammad, Abraham, Moses, etc. Taxonomy means how do we classify things, which is a lot to do with our role as kind of thinkers, programmers, mathematicians, science side. How do we categorize things? But it also happens part of the human mind and brain within ontology. Teleology, which is there a design behind things, or is it random? And teleology, all these have been taken over by information science also, and systems science. Ontology is about typing and type programming in terms of programming. Teleology used to be, was the world designed? Can we see the mind of God behind everything, or is it all accidental as a dichotomy? And that's the human ego brain having to find differences. Whereas now it's more, teleology is all throughout information science, because there are many things that are designed by humans, and other things that are sort of causal appearances And in systems thinking, we think of them as the law of unintended consequences. We're just looking at strings and chains of thought of cause and effect, and we're treating symptoms and not looking at the bigger picture and saying what's going on. And certainly the Baha'i faith is all about world building, rebuilding society, coming up with a new paradigm of ontology, who we are and who God is. Now, the twin arrows is a fun thing because this can actually help us a lot in terms of the practice of ontology. The twin arrows is an old Buddhist kind of Zen analogy or metaphor that Baha'u'llah has repeated in interesting ways, and Abdu'l-Baha. And that is that every time there's an event that happens that's negative or painful or acute suffering, a pain, a bad event, a catastrophe in our life, we have two arrows shot at us. One is the event itself, and the second arrow is then what we do with it afterwards with this chronic chain of thinking. And this ties to an idea that I call the Goldberg Heart. I don't know if you all remember Rube Goldberg was a wonderful engineer and cartoonist who used to come up with things like the mouse trap, where it takes 50 steps to catch the mouse. It's just these amazingly complicated devices to get to a more simple result. And it's a little humorous, but it's sad because this is how many of our hearts are. Our hearts are often wired, which is we want to have continual, endless joy. And yet to get to it, we use a Goldberg machine, contraption, device, where we try to do something to the outside world, the external world, to trigger an event or recognition or something that then comes back at us that then we can react to and feel a certain feeling. Now, this incredibly thought circuitous ontology, or the way we're seeing our reality, is ourselves versus the outside world. We're in the middle of the illusion of separateness, and we have to use those thoughts to feel. The sneaky trick, both in the wheel of thought with Buddhism and certainly in Baha'u'llah's ontology, which is humans, although the human reality is our thought, as Abdu'l-Baha said, there's a big thought and a little thought. There's a thought that's inspired from God, God's eye, God's thinking within the depths of our hearts, and what we do with it, the churning, the dwelling, the addictions, thinking about thought where we've got to mull it around and attach to it. And as Shoghi Pindi says, that we shouldn't continually dwell on the positive or the negative. And this is what thinking does. That wheel, the wheel of thought, takes us away from our primal joy and happiness. So there's those two types of suffering caused by the two types of thoughts. And that is acute, the pain that we've got to feel, that we all feel, to grow, and then what we do with it, how we react to it. Somebody cuts us off in traffic and we mull it around for hours, creating chronic suffering instead of that one little beep, and then our joy maybe took a little dim, but stayed there. It didn't. And at a certain point, we get so detached from the outside world, and we see that it's all inside, that we no longer have to react at all. So this strange thought sequencing, external response reaction thing that's going on as part of the reality that is a twin reality. In our ontology, we have the divine side and we have the human side, or we have the animal side. So we can be human animals or divine humans, and go with the ego, which was based on evolution and fear of survival, and having to overthink everything and look on and everything a million different ways and reframe, constantly churn the thoughts to make sure that that's a hose and not a snake. And survival needs this kind of stuff. This is how we evolved. But as spiritual beings, we are created to be happy and joyful and get off of that wheel of suffering. And of course, it's also, the Buddha says, caused by desire, and the Baha'i faith has a lot about the human reality there also. The three worlds are basically and if my classmates know this about me, I'm all about diagrams and this kind of thinking, which is, thinking in systems, thinking in diagrams, thinking graphically. And the three worlds, the Baha'i greatest name is, as you can see, it's like a three-world thing where you have the world of God, the world of manifestations, the world of man, and in those three worlds. So, okay, we get a bunch of notices here. That's great. But the idea of inseparability, when we are past the illusion of separateness and we become unified with God, with God's will, actually, it becomes our sole reality. In the Tablet of True Seeker, Baha'u'llah says that even a moment's separation would be unthinkable when you're in the city of certitude, gotten beyond thought and into the blissful reality of continually seeing his beauty. And that's pure bliss and joy all the time. And inseparability, quantum inseparability, another name for it is entanglement or superimposition. And it means being synced. And the interesting about God or the divine ontology or divine nature is he described both obviously as inaccessible, beyond our reason, our thinking, and yet immanent, and then finally inseparable. There's a certain point where we cannot divide the divine from everything else ourselves. But now this isn't pantheism. There's like 3 or 4 versions of that. And it's certainly not that. And we'll get to that in a second with the divine side of ontology. But systems science is, I call this, it's like, who was it, Colin Wilson, who wrote the Mind Parasites. Very cool novel, all about, we keep thinking because of these things that have taken over our brain. Well, the things are called ego and survival or evolution, but these are keeping us from our spiritual greatness and from our divine sides, our Atman. Baha'u'llah also says that he who forgets God, God will cause him to forget his own true self, or the Atman. So this is something important to continually focus and remember. God is our first, God is our last, God is our all. In our case, Baha'u'llah, who was our all we can reach of God in this world or the next. We cannot access the unknowable being, even though he's closer to us than our jugular vein, Baha'u'llah says. So moving into that, since we brought it up, the divine ontology, we can take the steps from atheism, which is, I can prove there is no God, or let's mock the idea of God or the opiate of the people and just make fun of it, actively say there is no God, and then you explain with another name, God. You say, oh, there is some kind of a automata going on, cellular automata or causal automata or systems automata that creates everything, and that's a different name for God. So even atheists have some kind of something they have to trust, because the heart drives us, not that chain of thoughts. So you need something to trust in deeply other than ego. So it comes down to self versus God. Baha'u'llah says, where is paradise and where is hell? The one is reunion with me, the other thine own self. And this is called adding partner to God. You just don't need the divine, and you reject it with your own thinking because of ego and self. And so that's kind of the tautology. We kind of have to work on that our whole life. It's something that's never goes away, because thought never goes away. It can be calmed, but it doesn't go away. And the next is kind of scientific. It's agnosticism, and it's really quite true that we really can't know if there is a God or not with our thoughts. That's true. And science is all about thought, isn't it? It's all about reasoning, being rational and reasoning. Well, we need no reasons for God. In fact, we can't frame him with reasons. I need a reason to believe. Well, do you really need a reason to be happy? That's what you're doing to yourself. When you say, I need a reason to believe, well, you need a reason to be happy. Agnosticism is correct that we can't know God. We can't even know if he exists. We say he exists. Well, what is existence? At his level, we have no clue. That's humility. We can't know. And that's where the Baha'is agree ontologically in that reality, that agnosticism is real. We cannot know God. But the intermediary, Jesus, Muhammad, Baha'u'llah, the Bab, all these intermediaries are what we can know of God. And they explain through kind of negation by saying what God isn't, what God is, and all about the heart and his existence and finding him in our hearts, etc., and loving him. So that gets back to the getting out of the Goldberg heart into the direct heart, where we have direct joy, bliss all the time, because we defeated this chain, this wheel of continually mulling and thinking and overthinking. So then pantheism is interesting. There are 3 levels of it. The first 2 are just forget it. And the third is something that Baha'u'llah and Abdullah kind of somewhat accept, but there's a trick there. The first 2 are that there's really no conscious God. Everything added up together is God, which is just silly and ridiculous. He is so personal. He gives us every moment of our life, at every moment, actively, totally actively involved. Baha'u'llah says if we forget God all the time, if he forgot us for even an instant, we'd cease to exist. So this is a continual act of creation by our beloved, our lover, beloved God, our divine God, whom we see as Baha'u'llah or Jesus or whatever manifestation we're in love with. But so that kind of pantheism, we want to get there. Second kind of pantheism is that everything is, God is conscious, but he actually is somewhat limited in that he is his creation. He's part of it. He's somewhat separate, but also part of it. And then you add it all up and he's in the seed that becomes a tree, etc., as our the writings for this section talk about a lot. That also is false because the divine God is completely detached from his creation in terms of needing it. He has no need for a creation. Our creation, everything other than God that he has created, is a complete act of selfless giving on his part. He says, Baha'u'llah tells us he stands in no need for creatures. He didn't create us because he needs us, or because it's part of him or part of. And there's all kinds of theories around pantheism too. This conscious God is also evolving, and he needs us to find out what he's doing right and wrong, and all kinds of humanistic projections on God. That's also silly. He's created infinite worlds over infinite eternities, does not need to learn something from our learning. It's all for us. The third one is kind of cool. And the third one is kind of like the names and attributes of God create things like the fashioner or the all-possessing. And in that sense, God is part of his creation, and his reality, which is ontology, is in all things. And in fact, Baha'u'llah says God is the inmost reality of all things. So there's a certain level of reality there that seems to be pantheistic because he's in every flower, he's in our every beloved puppy and kitten and child and everything else, that wherever we see love and feel love, that's God. So there, and yet there of course is a distinction that cannot be limiting. He's obviously conscious beyond. It's silly for a cartoon character to be telling the cartoonist, oh, I think you're conscious. So all these kind of ideas of God's existence are so childish and silly because we can't frame him. We can't think of him, describe him. All we can do is talk about the negation of what he isn't. So like Sabi says in our writings, if for this unit, if we say that he is all-powerful, we're saying he's not limited, that he has no powerlessness in him, but we can't understand what all-powerful or almighty really means. We've never seen that and we'll never see it. Same thing of existence. You can use that same word. He is, of course, pre-existing. In fact, Baha'u'llah says absolute existence is strictly confined to God, exalted be his glory. So he really is the only thing that does exist, but we can't even know what that means. In the divine sense, what does it mean to exist? And if it wasn't for Baha'u'llah, we would just not know a lot of this stuff about God at all. We'd be all agnostics because it is Baha'u'llah or Jesus and Muhammad that tells us all about God. In fact, they are God. They are the sign of God. They are the word of God made flesh on earth, the closest we can ever get to God. And falling in love with them and their beauty is falling in love with God. Obeying their will is obeying God's will. So that's the mixed kind of unseparated goodbye illusion of separateness, of inseparability. God and Baha'u'llah are inseparable. We and Baha'u'llah are inseparable. We and God and Baha'u'llah are inseparable. Looking at separateness is framing things the way our mind has to do dissection. We have a difference engine for a brain, which is the ego, and it uses the differencing engine of framing, which is thinking and thought, to divide things, to put borders on it, and to understand reality from a standpoint of science. But here's the kicker. Science and religion also are inseparable. And there's a great book by Clauser, The Illusion of, I mentioned this in our last it's the system, I can't see well enough to see my poor eyes. Oh, The Illusion of Religious Neutrality. Okay. Illusion of Religious Neutrality. It is so, Clauser is so brilliant because he takes his logic and opens all the frames into a systems view where you're unframing everything. You have God's vision, and every scientific theory has at its core a value proposition and a chain of thinking and of framing that goes back to ethics, to religion, to spirit. Whether it's in the inspiration, whether it's in not plagiarizing, whether it's in, all of the other sides of religions. And, as a mathematician, I could jump into math ontology, which is really fascinating. I won't. That's not what this is about. But there is, within math ontology, or what is real in math, there is the whole idea of different types of logic. There's an object logic and an observer logic. And this gets back down to framing, which is, how can you analyze anything with logic if you're looking at logic itself? You can't. You've got to separate them. The brain has to do that as part of framing. So then you end up with an objective logic and an object logic and an observer logic, and the observer is different than the object, and there is no object. In the end, any object that's put in motion is an event. So there's a whole kind of thing with the event horizon, and math does the same thing as we do on the religious side, which is math calls it skepticism, we call it humility, and on the spiritual side. But Clauser had just wonderful logic. You'd love reading this book. But it talks a lot about differencing frames, bias, the framing bias, and of course, systems ethics, where we have to have values that are brought to religion, to science by religion. We have to have the logic brought to religion by science. And it's one step further than that. He actually gets beyond the illusion of separateness to inseparability. And what's funny is when you listen to someone, everyone talks about enlightenment. What does it mean to be enlightened, awakened, all this other stuff? You can see in people's framing kind of where they're at. And that right there is a framing bias and an error in logic, because I'm saying, oh, look, person A can frame this way, person A frames it that way, and look how much smarter or more enlightened person A is than person B. There's the illusion of separateness again. There's only one inseparable being and soul. And so that, again, you give away your hand. So if you're saying, oh my goodness, especially if ego gets in, it's like, oh man, I had this fantastic, incredible new kind of realization, and everybody doesn't see that this is happening. And, now I can see it, and we can see it. I'm inviting you. Okay, you're framing things that like there's all these people that know stuff, and there's me. And it's like the old joke, hey, everybody's so stupid except for me and thee, and I'm not so sure about thee, So you're getting back down to this whole ego kind of thing when you're trying to separate things in that particular way, including, and Clauser just shows it so beautifully, he gets right down and it's inescapable that you cannot take spirit out of science, or intuition goes away. All the things that happen to all the discoveries and dreams go away. Whether it's you're looking at deductive or inductive, whether you're looking at things from inspiration, creation, or discovery, there's different ways to look at that in terms of especially creativity, but it's all the divine self, the Atman, completely inseparable from science. And this is a new concept from Baha'u'llah. It's not just they're unified or they're close, but they're one organism with two wings, and they can't fly without each other. They're absolutely inseparable. So there goes the illusion of separateness in religion. Framing, I just mentioned, we'll kind of end on framing, and maybe a little bit about ego, but framing is wonderful and terrible at the same time. If you're into math, it's all framing. You do all this abstraction and all these symbols, all these semiotics, and you get down to, and this is the idea of semantics. People a lot of times think, oh, philosophy, ontology, all this stuff is just a bunch of semantics. In fact, Baha'u'llah made kind of fun of things that begin with words and end with words when you don't get anything done. It's all thinking about thinking. It's you're watching the grasshopper wake up in the bed kind of thing. If you're doing Kafka, all this detail, but how does that help my life? But the thing about this is that semantics is not like that. Semantics is very important. Words are important. In fact, in the beginning of the word was with God, and the word was God. He was in the beginning. Without him was made nothing that has been made. And Baha'u'llah says, he takes that. Abdu'l-Baha analyzes the last Gospel of John, and Baha'u'llah takes it a billion steps further. He says, know thou moreover that the word of God, exalted be his glory, is higher and far superior to that which the senses can perceive, for it is sanctified from any property or substance. It transcends it transcendeth the limitations of known elements and is exalted above all the essential and recognized substances. It became manifest without any syllable or sound, and is none other but the command of God, which pervadeth all things. It's never been withheld from the world of being. It's God's all-pervasive grace, from which all other grace emanates. It's an entity far removed from all that has been and shall be. So the Word of God made flesh is like Jesus. The only way to get to God is through Jesus. That's true. And the only way to get to God in this age is through Baha'u'llah. I mean, that's what he says. This manifestation is how you know the next stage of what God is letting you know all about him. And there'll be a million endless cycles. It's not the end of the world kind of thing cycle. This is the last one. There'll be many more. But the whole idea of framing is that you have semantic framing. And here's a really cool thing from Steven Pinker, The Stuff of Thought. It's a wonderful book about semantics and language. He's such a great linguist. He says that the fact that rival controls of a single occurrence can trigger an extravagant court case tells us that the nature of reality does not dictate the way that reality is represented in any of our minds. Okay, there we go with representation and framing. And this is kind of his main statement about framing, because framing is partially semantic, as I have with that giant arrow there. And he's talking about the World Trade Center, where was it an event or two events? If it was an event, the owner of the building got 4.5 billion. And if it was two events, two buildings, each separately getting, then you get 9 billion. So there was, with one word, event, there was an extra 4.5 billion involved. And he says the language of thought allows us to frame a situation in different and incompatible ways. The unfolding of history on the morning of September 11th in New York can be thought of as one event or two events, depending on how we mentally describe it to ourselves, which in turn depends on what we choose to focus on, what we choose to ignore. In other words, there were two events, but there was one event, an act of terrorism. There were two events because of the two crashes. And the ability to frame an event in alternative ways is not just a reason to go to court, but also the source of the richness of human intellectual life. This framing is good and bad. As we shall see it provides the material for scientific and literary activity and creativity, humor and wordplay, and for all the dramas of social life. And it sets the stage for countless arenas of human disputation. Now, here's the thing I love. Does stem cell research destroy a ball of cells or a human being? Is the American military incursion on Iraq a case of invading a country or of liberating a country? Does abortion consist of ending a pregnancy or of killing a child? Are high tax rates a way to redistribute wealth or to confiscate earnings? Is socialized medicine a program to protect citizens' health or to expand government power? In other words, you're pitting framing one frame against the other, and this is happening all the time in our current political situation, which I will not bring up or mention because Baha'is are completely nonpartisan. But anyway, so you've got that semantic idea of framing. You've got coordinate framing, which I just love. This is getting into quantum physics, quantum field theory, where everything that we do is a way of looking at different coordinate systems. The observer, defined by Einstein, has been called all kinds of things with the Buddhist Dharma, and said, oh, the observer could create all these realities. What the observer what he meant by the observer, Einstein said, is he was confused with us all and almost a little amused by it, saying, hey, this whole thing about the observer, I meant framing and the coordinate system, the Cartesian coordinate system. Of course, you have Cartesian coordinates, you have spherical coordinates. When you get into optimization, when you get into the hardest field on Earth right now, which isn't rocket science, but antenna science. When you get into antenna science and optimization, you have to look at through 10, 11, 12 different frames of mathematics to get to where the solution's going. So all that framing is the coordinate system switching between spherical, 4 and 5 dimensional, 3 and 2 dimensional, lines to planes, and you got to go click, click, click. Like, remember the Predator in the Predator movie? Had that thing on his or her arm where you can go flash, 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 see ultraviolet, infrared, and then you see these are really fast framing of what you're looking on the outside. So, and we do that with mathematics all the time. Kinematics, whenever you cross a street, you are reframing your steps with 5 or 6 different framing systems in the brain of actually calculus. You're doing a lot of calculus to reframe this in different types of coordinate systems with kinematics, and we're just studying that in robotics right now. So also, the whole idea of our the first arrow and the second arrow, if you ask any human being about anything, ask 100 human beings, what do you think God is? You just know you're going to get 100 answers, right? You're going to get 100 answers because it's all framing. Everyone frames something a little bit differently. So this illusion of separateness, inseparability, I'm not saying we can't frame. That's our ego mind to survive. We need it. We need to move forward, and we're not going to sit on top of a mountain and do nothing. But we certainly can come from a place of continual happiness and joy. And that's the true practice of Baha'i Ontology, which is we can be happy and joyful all the time by seeing who we are, what we were created for and by. And that is reality. Our true reality is we are divine, godlike beings. We are immortal beings. As everyone says, we're an immortal being, have a mortal experience. All this body stuff in our manifestation and framing ourselves this particular way, Baha'u'llah continually talks us out of the illusion of selflessness and then steps beyond it, saying this whole world is an illusion. It's both an illusion of time and an illusion of space, of energy and of matter. And all those dichotomies that we make in the world of duality are leading us to freedom by detachment and freedom from ego thinking and the incessant chaining of thought with chronic suffering, and moving on to the love of God, which is mysticism. In fact, there's one kind of strange thing I didn't get to down here, was that after pantheism, pantheism 1, 2, and 3, and the one that's really close, which is where God's name and attributes are there in it. And he said, that's very close. The reason it's very close is the manifestation of God. We're talking about the will of God driving everything. And Baha'u'llah's will is God's will. So underneath everything, God's will is moving. And that is God's close participation imminently in all of our lives, in the depths of our hearts, and utter distance, the most hidden of the hidden, the most manifest of the manifest. And this is how the Baha'i faith and Baha'u'llah are unframing God, basically saying, superimpose it, get out of the illusion of separateness, stop trying to frame God as if we ever could that with this little human mind, and give in to your own Atman and self by loving God, because it's through the heart. We're talking here about not the Goldberg heart, driven by thought that we have to do all these machinations to get to, a little feeling of helplessness. I'm going to be happy as long as or as soon as. So my happiness is stuck in time. All these contingencies and conditions. Conditionality and contingency are the heart of framing. It's great. It's all throughout mathematics that you'll find everywhere. All our solutions, problem solving, etc. That we need to unframe to get to seeing with God's eyes, see him himself, dying to self and living in God. And he says, if you want to ascend even loftier heights, quit this mortal world of dust and seek to ascend unto the celestial abode, will then pass from this city into the city of absolute nothingness, that is dying to self and living in God. In this station, this most exalted habitation, this journey of utter self-effacement, wayfarer forgets the soul, spirit, body, and very being, immerseth himself in the sea of nothingness, and liveth on earth as one unworthy of mention. Nor will one find any sign of his existence, for he is vanished from the realm of the visible and attained unto the heights of self-abnegation. All right, if our sole reality is thought, and we stop thinking, what are we? Nothingness. We're starting to move into that thoughts given us by God state, where the thoughts tie to the feelings, and there is no separateness. There's none of this having our churn our way and work our way to a minute of little joy, and then we kind of dissect it and we lose all our joy by thinking about all the scary things that might happen to us, and all the things we've done wrong and how broken we are. Anyway, I've gone way longer than I want to go. So we will stop this sharing, and we will bid you adieu and thank you for, I know I've been seeing things in the chat too. I'm sorry. Everybody asking questions in the chat. We will definitely get to that, but I don't want to make this go so long that nobody will again want to watch it. So, all right, where are we? We'll stop the screen sharing right now, and we will get back to this, and then we will, what do we do? Have to stop our recording. All right, we are stopping recording. And